Welcome, David Zell. How you doing, man?
You did
That
not
was
do
a
David justice.
that
That
was
was
an
the most.
interesting introduction.
That was a. I love you, Pete. That was fucking terrible. David, I want to tell a story. The first time I met David, um, he did a backflip, and then out of nowhere, just totally unexpected, and then punched a hole through a wall next to us and pulled a physical Bitcoin out of the wall. And I was like, that doesn't even make sense. Like that's not a thing. Bitcoin is a digital currency, and he did it anyway. Um, David, you've done an incredible amount in the space. I would love to hear your summary of who you are, what you're about, and why what you're doing is important.
Yeah, sure. So I'm David. I first started using Bitcoin when I was in seventh grade. So that was like I guess fall of 2013. Wasn't until later that I kind of started getting more into the space and like actually learning about Bitcoin. I was actually just using it for a while. But since then, I've done different things. Definitely a cypherpunk kind of at my core, and I spent a while working to sort of derail capital market, sort of private market investment into private prisons. So I led an organization for a little over a year that disrupted about $3 billion worth of private prison financing. And then I started moving into like Bitcoin policy work. So I worked as the head of policy at Bitcoin Magazine for like 9 or 10 months, and then left there to start BPI, which is the nonprofit think tank called the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And we do a lot of cool research on Bitcoin. We also do research on sort of other things as they're relevant to Bitcoin. So we talk about stable coins. We compare proof of work and proof of stake. And most of our work is centered around sort of educating lawmakers in DC. So yeah, that's me.
You also did an amazing job hosting one of my favorite panels at Bitcoin 2022 with Andrew Yang, Joe Jorgensen, Alan Farrington, and incredible journalist Glenn Greenwald on
Yeah.
kind of overcoming idea inertia.
Hmm.
You've you've done a bunch of great
Yeah, that was
stuff.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. Meeting Glenn was fun. Meeting Andrew Yang was fun. And Joe is just so cool. She is like the I know like people it's a cringe thing to say, but Joe Jorgensen is the least politician-y of any politician that I've met. Like Joe instantly kind of just feels like a friend. So yeah, shout out to Joe Jorgensen. She's pretty cool.
Yep, yep. I could not agree with you more. Um, I want to talk about the work that you're doing right now around the financial inclusion letter that you guys just put out. Can you talk to us about what that is, why it's important, and what you're trying to achieve with that letter?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of weeks ago, a group of global technology experts, notably like functionally none of them, used a currency other than the dollar or the euro, wrote a letter to Congress, sort of in support of what they called responsible crypto policy. And in this letter, they just say a bunch of things that aren't true. The notable kind of claims, however, at least the ones that stood out to me, were sort of the arguments that Bitcoin had no real world utility, that it was a solution in search of problems. And their criticisms were about crypto overall. And so it was weird because in some ways I read that letter and agreed with a lot of it in reference to like the crypto industry overall, which is certainly like rife with scams and are worth denouncing. But in their letter, they kind of just ignore uh, the sort of lives of like basically half the world who live either under authoritarianism, which is 56% of people on the entire planet live under authoritarianism. A billion people live with like massive inflation and many of them hyperinflation. And it's here, sort of at the edges of the sort of modern, connected, globalized world, where people that are living lives that most of us in the West could never imagine use Bitcoin not to speculate, uh, but as a critical tool. And so uh, when this letter came out, for their claims to be true, these global tech experts, you have to kind of just accept that the stories that for example, Alex Gladstein has worked for several years now to shed light on just like aren't true, or that those people aren't real. To say that Bitcoin is a solution in search of problems is to tell these people that their problems aren't real, that they're not real. And so I thought it was really important to make that obvious. So they registered the domain concerned.tech. So I registered the domain financialinclusion.tech, and I encourage anyone who's watching this to go to that website, because when you do, you'll find some samplings of mainstream news articles that have referenced Bitcoin's role for those facing authoritarianism or economic crisis. And then you'll find a letter which was sent to Congress that sort of details the experiences of the authors. So it was signed by 21 human rights activists from 20 different countries, including Gary Kasparov, chess grandmaster, Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation, Farida Yemeni, like all of these incredible activists from all over the world wrote this powerful, powerful letter. And so I just sort of played the role in facilitating it. So, made the website and, had our team at BPI make sure that it got into the right hands, and sort of coordinated that. But this is really about the authors of the letter. I coordinated it, but it would be far more powerful for someone watching this to just go read the letter instead of hear me talk about it, because the way that they explain how Bitcoin has, it hasn't been a meme, it hasn't been a speculative vehicle. It has worked when like nothing else did. And there's one line that I think is worth highlighting from this letter. I mean, they're all like bangers, and it's an incredible sort of testament to Bitcoin's power and prominence. But they say, to most in the West, the horrors of monetary colonialism, misogynist financial policy, frozen bank accounts, exploitative remittance companies, and an inability to connect to the global economy may be distant ideas. To most of us and our communities, and to the majority of people worldwide, they are daily realities. If there were, quote, far better solutions already in use to overcome these challenges, we would know. And yeah, it's just everyone should read it.
Very powerful stuff. I mean, especially in this country and most Western and developed nations, we have the privilege, I think, of not really having to give thought or consideration to our money, where it comes and how we're really using it. Talk to us a little bit about some of the conversations that you've been having with the U.S. government around the necessity for Bitcoin to exist in an economy that maybe has a more functioning currency or money.
Yeah. Wait, sorry. Is the question about sort of conversations?
What's your conversations
about this financial...
with U.S. Congressmen people around Bitcoin?
Yeah, so they're pretty far ranging. I would say a couple of baskets of conversations are most common. So I guess to start, I think there are elevating national security concerns, particularly in the like Biden administration, about Bitcoin. The sort of climate, like ESG stuff, gets a lot of attention and is certainly a place where regulators and policymakers are looking. But in a lot of ways, I think national security drives tech policy. And Bitcoin is just a policy issue. It's really no different from a regulatory or policy standpoint. Well, I take that back. From a tech policy perspective, it's just not that different, right? You understand what the internet is. You can explain to someone that Bitcoin is like the internet of money. And in these tech policy conversations, historically, national security has been like a driving piece. So I'll give a quick example. The debate around sort of breaking up big tech. So our antitrust laws in the United States are super old. They were written to apply to sort of monopolies of supply, like think sort of the oil barons of like the early 1900s. And so many have argued that what we experience now are not monopolies of supply, but are monopolies of demand. So think of companies like Amazon, who have better data than anyone else, and they're able to get companies, they're able to sort of leverage that data to get more users, to get more data, to get more users, etc. So it's a big problem. People are concerned about it. There have been proposals to break up big tech, particularly from, like people like Elizabeth Warren. I think a lot of the reason that those conversations have flatlined is because sort of grand strategists and national security thought leaders recognized that to compete with China on issues like AI, we needed data, and that these corporations being sort of together and not split apart allowed us to get better data sets to train AI. And so some of those conversations about all the benefits of breaking up big tech kind of just died down. And I tell that story not to go off on a tangent, but to kind of reinforce this idea that there are pros and cons of technologies. But ultimately, if the government comes to believe that a technology is sort of damaging to its sort of domestic status or international stature, that's going to sort of outweigh everything else. It's like concern number one. And so this first basket of conversations that I have with policymakers and that our team does is to sort of first address some of these concerns about like Bitcoin being used to evade sanctions, which is just kind of not really the case, or Bitcoin being used to elicit or sort of to facilitate like ransomware or cybercrime, which has some truth to it. But mostly we try to tell a different story, one that's backed by data and backed by observations about Bitcoin over the past few years. And that story is that, Bitcoin, like the internet, can be a really powerful tool for spreading democratic values. We sort of realized over the last 15 years that giving people access to sort of the freedom of information, the ability to find and post and communicate to anyone anywhere in the world, is this sort of inherently like democratic, like sort of classical liberal value. We saw the Arab Spring in part caused by social media. And while there are sort of drawbacks, and the internet has also been used as a tool to control and surveil, there's a reason the State Department sort of funds the development of internet overseas, because generally we think that the free flow of information is good. So we say the free flow of value is good in that same way. And so we talk about sort of China's CBDC sort of rollout. We talk about sort of people in emerging markets who, like in this letter, so like the authors in this letter, lack alternatives to the existing financial system. And if the choice is between, people across the world where SWIFT is sort of failing. I mean, you see correspondent banking relationships in like Africa and the Middle East and South America down like, 20% over the last 10 years, where people are sort of losing access to the legacy rails of finance. It's far better for America that they join an open, neutral monetary network as opposed to a closed authoritarian monetary network that allows Xi Jinping to internationalize his rule of law. And in the same way that America can sit here in the West and say, well, this transaction that occurred thousands of miles away in another country is illicit finance or terrorism, and because we control the rails of finance, we're going to censor that transaction. There's nothing stopping Xi Jinping from doing the same thing. And so that presents a national security threat to the United States, and one that Bitcoin like very clearly solves. So a lot of conversations happening about national security, energy and the environment, of course. We sent a 10-page sort of research report to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where we kind of first and principally make the argument that a conversation about Bitcoin's negative environmental impacts has to be framed by a discussion of its benefits. Otherwise you're just sort of set up to get a predetermined conclusion. I mean, if you look at the negative externalities of anything in a vacuum, you're never going to like come to any conclusion other than that thing is bad. So you have to start by understanding Bitcoin's social value, like why a world with Bitcoin is better than a world without it. then you can get into the energy conversation. And there we sort of do an analysis of, what is Bitcoin's actual environmental impact, and sort of conclude by going through the ways in which Bitcoin may actually be quite good for not only the environment, but also the stability of grids and U.S. energy independence. So that was written by two of our sort of climate people at BPI. And then Troy Cross and Margot Pace, shout out to them. Uh, and those, I would say, are kind of the two most important conversations that are going on now, is Bitcoin's impact on the environment, and sort of Bitcoin's impact on the U.S. sort of relative strategic position. So yeah.
Seems like they're keeping you very busy.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot to unpack there. I like, without getting too into the weeds to start, give us just maybe like the surface level of, we see and hear a lot of the FUD that comes out of the mainstream media, and I'm sure this is a lot of what you spend your time on, as you shared. Bitcoiner's favorite person, Elizabeth Warren, seems to be at the forefront of your mind. I mean, let's just start there. Like, you're talking to Lizzie Warren. What is the first thing that you're finally telling her so she can wrap her mind around the fact that she's an idiot?
Well, I probably wouldn't insult her, for sure. It seems like a bad
Pussy.
strategy. I don't know what I would say to Elizabeth Warren. I think I'd start by having her read this letter, actually. I couldn't think of a better sort of primer for the type of conversation that I would want to have. Um, you know, this idea of sort of convincing like individual politicians about, when someone has kind of branded themselves around a policy issue, I think the probability of them just sort of, it's tough to kind of 180 and save face at the same time. It's one thing if you made some negative comments and change your mind, but Elizabeth Warren has positioned herself as a crusader against Bitcoin. And uh, without kind of getting too speculative, there are reasons that I would be pessimistic on face about my or anyone else's ability to get through to her. I think the main thing would be read this letter, and then second is understand that there is a difference between crypto and Bitcoin, and we cannot let conversations that are adjacent to Bitcoin, right? Like whether it's stable coins, risks to the financial system, or whether it's crypto Ponzi's with like digital yams that you get like 600% APY on until all your money's gone because it was a Ponzi. Like those are problems. The latter are, and the former is a reasonable conversation to have. But I think that we are kind of on a precipice. And I don't know if I'd say this all to Elizabeth Warren, but just kind of context here. I think that we are on a sort of precipice of deciding and locking in which rights that are sort of de facto, because of the legacy world, do we take into the world that's like radically changed by technology. And cash is just like the obvious example of that. Like, nowhere do you have a right to cash, but the sort of Constitution was written in a world in which nothing other than cash realistically was conceivable, or something quite like it. Um, and proposals for digital currencies are happening like now and are rolling out now. And I'm really worried about the authoritarian sort of bends of those proposals, and think an insufficient amount of public attention and thought has gone into what sort of principles and technical opportunities and limitations do we bake into a new sort of global monetary network. So yeah, it's just, I think it would be, look, this is being used by tens of millions of people across the world, and that's not, you can just read these people tell you their stories. And second is that you need to think about Bitcoin differently, because when I think about our ability to have an open, permissionless, like credibly neutral monetary protocol, which are things that are kind of just, I think, should be important to people. I don't think we have a better shot at it right now than Bitcoin. So yeah, this is useful for real people all over the world, and Bitcoin is not crypto. those would be the two things I'd try to get across.
So this is interesting because we were talking before you jumped on about this. I made the claim that, when we talk about a two-party system, that really we're kind of operating in a world where there are Democrats and Republicans can basically be said to be kind of the Washington Generals and the Harlem Globetrotters, and then they just switch every 4 to 8 years. And that it's very difficult to engage openly and honestly with these entities like Elizabeth Warren and many others on both sides of the aisle, because really the things that they are saying are not actually representative of what they believe or effectively communicating kind of why they are representing the things that they're representing. So my question to you is this: like, how do you think about? First of all, do you agree that there is that disconnect that someone like Elizabeth Warren is never going to engage openly and honestly with this awesome letter that you have helped put together, because really she doesn't care what it says or what the objective truth is. It's about pushing an agenda that she is specifically interested in. So what do you think about kind of that? Do you think that's true? And second, kind of how do you, if you do, how do you engage with that and operate in a world where that's kind of what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know. Who knows? Some people are persuadable, some aren't. But I think that people in the aggregate are persuadable. Um, and I think that some of this you do to try to sort of convince people or educate people on that real individual level. But whether or not Elizabeth Warren is receptive to the truth about Bitcoin, I think her supporters can be, and that's ultimately like what sort of matters here. Uh, you can change someone's incentives if you change people's hearts and minds, and I just think that when more people hear stories about Bitcoin that are not just designed to make the reader hate it, which is just like most of the content that people consume about Bitcoin, that process can happen. And so I'm optimistic on public opinion on Bitcoin. Um, I don't really know many people who've spent a meaningful amount of time looking into Bitcoin that have come away from it, at the very least, not like optimistic. Uh, and thinking that this is cool and probably good. So yeah, I think over time more people will be pro Bitcoin because people will be they'll be using it, right? It'll be like being pro TCP/IP. Like no one walks around with like internet protocol bumper stickers on their car. It's just like the backbone of the internet. And so I think if at least my personal prediction plays out, I think there will be a substantial increase in the number of people that are using Bitcoin in their day-to-day lives, whether or not they sort of see it or interact with it. And yeah, I think we have kind of this window basically where no one really knows what's happening, and there are so many sort of reasons to be scared. And you can look to sort of this is the same stuff as like the Clipper debate in like the 90s. Like the sort of early cypherpunks were writing about the same thing. They're talking about crypto, not like cryptocurrencies, but crypto as in cryptography. And it was just really obvious, like, what are the arguments against it? They're going to say that crypto enables money laundering, financial crime, that it is bad for national security. Like the world is definitely changed by innovations like cryptography and innovations like Bitcoin. It was also changed by innovations like the internet and innovations like the printing press. And some of these innovations fundamentally restructured what distribution of power between a sovereign and a people were sort of possible. It was really easy to censor information when no one could print their own. The Catholic Church in the West controlled all of what was printed and essentially all of what was said and essentially all of what was thought. And then the printing press comes, and the genie's just sort of out of the bottle. We adapt and we readjust. And of course, the people that get the printing press dropped on them when they benefited from people not being able to print their own information weren't too happy about it. But the anti-printing press moment, didn't last very long because it just made the world better. And so I kind of just look at it on this like long arc of like, we will probably continue to create technologies that fundamentally restructure what distributions of power are possible. And I think technologies that tend toward openness, that tend toward protecting and sort of treating everyone the same, which Bitcoin does. It's the same rules for everyone, and anyone can use it. In the same way that a printing press could be built by anyone and used by anyone, and the internet could be built and used by anyone. So, yeah, I expect the sort of anti-Bitcoin stuff to be short-lived, and who knows how it plays out. There are lots of scenarios. Don't know if we have the time to get into all of that, but yeah, I do expect this stuff to be relatively short-lived. But right now, it's just checking all of these boxes. It's like if you're a policymaker in the United States in 2022 and you hear that something is bad for the environment, that it's threatening our carbon goals, that it's horrible for national security, like yeah, and you kind of maybe believe in confidence that this sort of competes with the dollar. Um, it's kind of a recipe to be like hated by Washington. Um, I don't think it needs to be that way because I don't think that threat is real. And I don't think the threat is the same as some of the critics think. It will and has restructured what is possible with money, but I don't think that's a negative thing for the United States. I think it is sort of stands in a legacy of innovations that made human flourishing like more readily available, that led to information and speech being more accessible and not controlled. And so I do just see this as like the long arc of like our speech getting freer, and our ability to share our ideas and to interact with each other regardless of physical proximity, happening more and more. And I think that's just obviously good.
P's muted, so I'm gonna. I mean, to be honest, I want to take the conversation somewhere else. So, P, if you have something else in this line of thought,
No, go for it.
a big part of this conversation we've been having to you, and I say and present this question not as necessarily my opinion or belief, but just to Zell, you can't do that, guy.
I'm so
This
sorry.
fucking guy. This is not my perspective, not my belief. I just want to, play a little game with you. So a lot of this conversation has been around the importance of Bitcoin, not for Americans, but for, people in developing and countries that need this. What though, like, why would Americans who are very much anti-American interventionism and feel as though American interventionism has caused so many of our problems back here, why do we feel like we need to continue a narrative around this digital, imaginary, fake money that you're saying is important for people in another country, but like we don't necessarily need it? So like, why do we even need to have this conversation? So talk to us about that thought process.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The United States is a policy leader, and other countries around the world look to America when they try to make decisions at home. So the decisions we make here, that our leaders make here, have international implications, often in negative ways. But the main message is that we have a responsibility to set a global precedent. Otherwise, we are responsible for taking away a tool that so many have said is just indispensable, in order to sort of carry out their daily lives.
I mean, I've not been convinced to care about Bitcoin as a American whole heart. Kidding, obviously. You look so serious right now and angry at me.
No, I'm not. Sorry.
He's
Just kind
on the
of
side,
staring
like, what
off.
the fuck?
Yeah.
Get off Facebook, man.
I'm not on Facebook. I'm just kind of listening.
Let's talk a little bit about, Bitcoin has become a talking point for a lot of politicians. We saw it in the last most recent election. There were a few different Bitcoin or pro Bitcoin politicians running in races. Unfortunately, none of them were able to, I think, win. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Zell. But what are your expectations with the midterms coming up and we have 2024? What role, if any, will Bitcoin have? And I want to first start Bitcoin. And yes, I'm going to say the bad word, so P, you can bleep it out. But what role will crypto also have? Because I feel like the two, unfortunately, will be tied together on the national political stage.
It's a great question. So far, crypto political efforts have far outpaced Bitcoin specific political efforts. SBF, GMI PAC, there's been sort of millions and millions of dollars committed to political spending. Although it's worth noting that that Sam's political spending is entirely based on candidates' sort of stances on things like pandemic preparedness, and he wants to sort of bring the effective altruism lens to public policy. Um, so I don't know if that counts as crypto political spending, but yeah, crypto political spending has far outpaced Bitcoin political spending. It's just a fact. Like the gap is, I mean, it was massive. Like I don't even think Erica Rhodes got more than like a Bitcoin like donated to her. Maybe right around that. So, what impact will it play on the elections in a bear market? Probably not much. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think when Bitcoin is like pumping and you're like a politician and you're like, holy shit, like 40 million Americans own this and they love it because it's made them wealthy. Uh, it's like a reason to kind of go to a meeting. It's a reason to talk to people. It's a reason to maybe integrate it into your campaign, particularly if you're someone like, for example, John Ossoff, like in Georgia. I think would be a really reasonable person to like go pro Bitcoin because like he's not going to lose anyone on the left, and he might be able to pick up some like libertarians on the right who would have voted for someone else. So there are these like sort of instances where I think being pro Bitcoin could be like relatively strategic for your campaign, um, and overall I think like good, but from a tactical perspective. But I don't know what impact sort of Bitcoin is going to have on the midterms. At this point, I would say the biggest impact has been more kind of about the Overton window of Bitcoin. Like it's become a public policy issue. It's become a public policy debate in Washington. Um, so that shift is monumental, though its impact is difficult to assess or foresee. But it is notable that this time around we had people running for the highest elected offices in the United States talking about Bitcoin, whether it was that they loved it or whether it was that they hated it. I also think we saw this cycle, a politicization of Bitcoin that I found like reprehensible, and it's just stupid.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Satoshi said it. Like Satoshi said, all you need to sort of to know about this, that Bitcoin's best strategy was just to like stay low key and just like exist. And when or if a sort of escape velocity moment happens, like I think it was inevitable that Bitcoin became a public policy issue. What was not inevitable was that it so quickly became like it started to sort of become a left versus right thing. Tucker Carlson, and it's just like obvious. Like people talk about Bitcoin is bipartisan. Bitcoin is bipartisan. It's not like a magic enchantment. Like if you just say that enough times, it becomes bipartisan. Like that's not how it works. Like the reality is that Bitcoin became politicized. This isn't to say that this isn't to talk about sort of partisan politics. Like it's not the point. But the point is that it's very clear that the Republicans became pro Bitcoin and the Democrats became anti Bitcoin. I think that it'll be interesting to see whether in a bear market, when discussions about Bitcoin maybe start to change in sort of shape and tenor, whether that politicization sticks. because I think it's just net bad that Bitcoin is partisan. It makes it a bad environment to do Bitcoin things in the United States, to like be a builder or an innovator. If you're having to kind of hold your breath every 4 years to see which party wins, uh, and that sort of shift of the pendulum could fundamentally change your business, or put you out of business, why would you be here? And so I think that Bitcoin benefits from exposure to the U.S. capital markets. It benefits from exposure to our rule of law, and uh, yeah, I think politicization jeopardizes the lives of U.S. Bitcoiners. Like the network will be fine regardless of what happens in the U.S., but uh, I think it threatens Bitcoin users and Bitcoiners when Bitcoin becomes politicized. So those are, I think, were the two kind of most notable things. I would say from the Bitcoin side, it wasn't really campaign finance as much as it was shifting the Overton window, sort of the bounds of dialogue, and unfortunately, sort of sowing the seeds of Bitcoin becoming kind of a one-party issue, which I think is just not a good outcome.
No, and there's a very interesting thing you've actually brought up that maybe I've just been naive. Thankfully, politics have not been on the forefront of my mind because people like you and
Good.
Grant exist. So thank you for giving me some peace and tranquility in my life, or returning the peace and tranquility to my life. But the idea of like what actually does Bitcoin's role look like in the political sphere in a bear market is actually super, super interesting, because you're right. When the price is pumping, everyone and their mother is talking about it. But when it's down, everyone just wants to like kick us and be like, "Oh, you doing?" I got so many texts over the last week of like, "Are you alive?" Like, I just need to make sure. And deactivating my, or deleting my Instagram account or the app off my phone and then not being on Instagram, apparently people really thought that I had done something to myself. So I'm alive. I'm okay, guys. Bitcoin's price, I want it to go lower. Um, but I want to now play the inverse of this. So we've seen a lot of, more so on the left, this attack on Bitcoin through an ESG narrative. But do you think those types of attacks and that narrative will continue in a bear market? Or will the bear market also help take some of that negative pressure? And I think pressure is the wrong word I'm choosing, but I'm just going to stick with it. But that negative pressure, negative perspective around Bitcoin, can that dissipate during the bear market if no one's talking about it? Or will it still be a let's kick them while they're down situation, in your opinion?
I think bear markets are where new narratives are born. And I think that bear markets make Bitcoin maximalists, like historically. So for me, the biggest difference in the bear market is I think it's just going to be quieter. Um, and I think that sort of experience of watching uh, Celsius and 3AC and this whole fallout, and then who knows how far or wide contagion in the markets like spread. I don't really know. Uh, but what I do know is that in times like this, it is much easier to make that second point that I said that I would make to Elizabeth Warren in a hypothetical conversation, which is that it's not to say that everything that isn't Bitcoin is a scam. I don't think that's true, um, but it's to say that like the overwhelming majority of things that aren't Bitcoin are scams, and it is very important from a policy perspective to recognize that Bitcoin is sort of different enough, both in its design and its function and its sort of aspiration, that it warrants kind of focused consideration. Like it warrants being sort of separated from everything else. And I don't necessarily mean that like laws will start like that's not necessary. I mean, this stuff's all kind of regulated together, but the conversations around Bitcoin cannot be properly had if they're in the context of conversations about crypto. Um, so yeah, I think it's a good time to make that point, because when everything is pumping and you have millions of dollars coming into DC from the VC money and all of this stuff. Like, I'm sure that being a staffer, in the last year since the infrastructure bill, uh, has been very interesting hearing like all of these people who, you know, are saying Web3 is the future, this is the future, you know, proof of stake is the future, and then oh no, Bitcoin is the future. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think the bear market is going to flush out a lot of excess and a lot of grift, and I think it'll present a clearer picture of this point. So yeah. But yeah, again, I think like campaign financing is unlikely to be kind of a factor from the Bitcoin side. I think it still probably will be and has been from the crypto side of things. So yeah, bear markets make maximalists. Bear markets, yeah. Like I saw someone in the chat said, you know, you get the moon boys who are only here for NGU. Yeah, exactly. Like it's just easier to like talk about Bitcoin when, you know, it's quieter, and I think that's true in BC in DC as well.
Sorry, one thing I want to ask you about is, you know, Putin just gave this speech, I think 5 or 6 days ago, and he said a lot of interesting things that relate to the kind of international monetary policy and have implications for Bitcoin. I wanted to go through some of the highlights from that and sort of get your thoughts. So he talked about the freezing of FX reserves and assets and said the very principles of the global economic systems have taken a blow. Fundamental business notions as business reputation, the inviolability of property, and trust in global currencies have been seriously damaged. He also said, when I spoke at Davos Forum a year and a half ago, I also stressed that the era of a unipolar world order, has come to an end. I want to start with this, as there's no way around it. This era has ended despite all the attempts to maintain and preserve it at all costs.
Yeah, sure, I can comment on that. Yeah, sort of two pieces I think immediately worth noting. The first is, you know, it's a difference of opinion, man, about sort of the principles of the monetary order. I mean, yeah, I'm sure if your principles of the monetary order include, you know, you not being the subject to like nation state asset seizure, like, yeah, it's a violation. But you know, there are people doing the seizing and freezing would say that it's not violating the principles of the global monetary order, or whatever that like word salad is. It's all socially constructed, like, you know. And you know, that's yeah, sure. Of course, Putin is going to say that. Of course, America is going to say the exact opposite. I don't know if there's much use getting into it there. As far as the, you know, unipolar world, you know, I would contest that we really have a unipolar world. I think that was more sort of characteristic of like America after World War II. But I think it is fair to say that we're in a multipolar world and have been for some time. Now, I think what he's really sort of referring to is less sort of international like polarity, which is just a, you know, made up political science word, like, you know, multipolar world, everyone shares power. Bipolar world, think like whatever sort of the Cold War, you know, you got like two big powers and everyone else kind of orbiting around them. And then a multipolar world in which there are relative differences in power, but there's not like one single just dominant force. And I think there's arguments to be made that we're still in a unipolar world. There are arguments to be made that we are in a multipolar world. I think what he's sort of getting at, though, is that what the war in Ukraine has done, and what these sort of sanctions have kind of concretized, is a bifurcation of the international financial system. But this is a story that began a long time ago. It didn't happen overnight. I actually saw someone in the live stream chat like earlier on in the show talking about like BRICS, and I can't remember what that was in reference to, but you know, you have to sort of start there. You know, Brazil, Russia, you know, India, China, etc. There has sort of been the building of parallel institutions to those in the West for quite some time. So I think it was 2012 when China launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is essentially just a competitor to the IMF, who for, you know, decades sort of stood alone in terms of the It was a monopoly. Like it had a particular it sort of had a particular mission and charter that no one else was fulfilling. Then the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank happens, and they start saying, whereas the IMF had told all of these nations that wanted to get money, you have to jump through, I mean, literally, I think the average number of conditionalities to those loans is like 430. So you have to jump through 400 something hoops to get our money. China just started handing out money like for free, no strings attached, basically. Well, strings attached, but not in the same way as sort of the conditionalities on IMF.
Invisible strings.
Well, and so what happened is the average number of IMF loan conditionalities like declined, I think, into like the 30s now. And so essentially, you saw like a monopoly transform into a market where competing institutions were forced to kind of outperform the other in order to fulfill their mission. And I think what Putin is referring to here is a sort of continuation of that trend where we are changing from a world in which the rails of globalization, like finance and the internet, are all held by the West, that new systems that serve the same function are being built by sort of rising, powers or illiberal states, like whatever you sort of basket you want to sort of lump them in. And so you see, sort of alternatives to SWIFT, where sort of China and Russia have been working there. It's not like Russia has really used Bitcoin to evade sanctions so much as it's just used like gold and like yuan. And so what Putin is pointing out, I think, or hinting at here, is true, even though I would kind of laugh at the first part of his statement and generally I don't know how true I don't know, it's the semantics there, but his overall point that there's like this decoupling from like a Western monopoly on payment infrastructure and internet, and now a world where we have sort of competing versions of things from like the BRICS nations. That's true. That's just that's sort of my reaction there. That is a 100% true observation, and it's sort of up for us to decide whether or not Putin's claim about sanctions violating this principle of the global monetary order. We collectively as a species determine what those principles are, and I do think that what we are seeing and what we're on the precipice of is kind of a battle between open monetary networks and open networks, permissionless networks, and closed networks, surveilled networks, aggregated, mined, controlled, and censorable networks. I kind of hope that open networks like sort of prevail, and I think they will.
Love it. So I know you have a hard stop in about 5 or 6 minutes. We've asked you a bunch of questions, and I want to give you the opportunity to direct the conversation for a moment. What have we not asked you? What are things that are happening right now in the space that are super important and that people should be thinking about, or that you have been spending a lot of time thinking about?
It's a good question. I'm definitely watching to see just like how the market plays out. I guess it's just more of a curiosity and less interested in less about Bitcoin, but I am interested to see if there are other insolvencies, and to see how the kind of crypto market sort of fares for the next few months. But on Bitcoin in particular, some things to be tracking are the White House sort of the Biden executive order is chugging along, and so we're going to start hearing more about that soon. We're going to start seeing reports that are written, and I expect, like I mentioned earlier, the sort of two big conversations about the environment and national security, I think, will increase in prevalence in Washington. And those are, I guess, in my line of work, the where I sort of foresee most of my future time being spent, is sort of overseeing research and having meetings with staffers and sort of working to combat some of the mistruths that are out there about these two topics.
Love it.
Zell, where can everyone stay up to date with everything you guys are cooking up and working on?
btcpolicy.org, our website, or btcpolicy.org, our Twitter, which is super new. Or you can just like probably follow me on Twitter. I tend to tweet about the stuff we're doing.
What's your Twitter address? That's
David Zell _.
David Zell _. Got it.
That's right.
Wait, you're not David _Zell_?
No, I am not.
Fuck, I need to go get that Bitcoin back.
No, I'll send you two. I promise. That was me.
Okay, come on, man. Don't leave me waiting, guys. If you love anything political, the work that David and his team are doing is vital for, I think, the future of Bitcoin, especially in the political space. Stay up to date with it. Give them a follow. Stay up to date with all their work. David, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We know you are one of the busiest people out there, so keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks, guys. Enjoyed it. Take care.